What is up, everyone? This is Josh, and today I want to bring you guys a Centurion deck profile / deck discussion of the list that I played at my most recent WCQ regionals last weekend, which was the first tournament I entered in this new format. And I played Centurion because it is one of the decks that I currently am considering for YCS Bologna in a couple of weeks. So I wanted to walk you through the list that I played, reasons why I played it, and also some potential changes and some learnings that I did or took away from the tournament. Now, this was recorded live on Twitch, where people also had the opportunity to ask me some questions and give some input on the deck profile. So I hope it's helpful, and if you want to be part of that next time when it's happening live, then feel free to check out the link in the description down below and follow me over on Twitch. It was a good start to the day. I pulled a Deception and 2 Ultra Rares in my entry packs, and then it went downhill from there relatively quickly. It wasn't that bad. I won round 1 against Heroes, and then I lost round 2 to Tenpai and round 3 to White Forest Toy Box stuff because they kept opening Toy Box plus White Forest cards. That was very hard to beat. I started 1 and 2, and then I ended up finishing 5 and 3, which obviously wasn't as good as I hoped for, but I still figured we would go over it. As I said last week, I was going to try Centurion at this regional because I think this deck is pretty fun. I've been having a great time in Master Duel with it as well, and I just like the concept of this deck in this format because this deck is pretty good into Molcharmy Fuvolas. It's very good into Molcharmy Purulia. It does not get completely destroyed by Dimension Shifter, and a lot of other cards that really dominate the format right now are not as bad into this deck than they are into other decks. Like, for example, Different Dimension Ground is not terrible against this deck. Even though this deck is quite synchro focused, even Dimensional Barrier is surprisingly less of an issue than you would think, because you can very easily just set up your stuff and synchro summon on the opponent's turn with the field spell, and it genuinely is fine. It seemed rather immune to variance, right? Like, you wouldn't lose to those super powerful random cards as often as you would with other decks. In return, I was happy to accept the fact that it did have a lower ceiling than some of the other combo decks in the format. If you're playing Centurion right now, you're probably going to always play 3 Trudea and 3 Primeras as your normal summon starters. You're going to play 1 Atri. I feel like with this new version of the deck, this card has kind of become the heart and soul of it, because this card allows you to draw an extra card every turn once you're set up. With the new level 8 Synchro, being able to set up an Emblema card in your graveyard every time when you get to play, this is what takes this deck from being like kind of fair, low ceiling, to a deck that will outgrind most decks in the format as long as it gets to play. And then we play 1 Gargoyle. I hate Gargoyle with a passion, and I do not know if I would play this again. I know everyone considers this card standard. Looking back at it, I wanted to try this, and I have some ideas on how you could improve this deck. Some of these cards that are cute to make your combos even stronger might not be necessary. You always play 3 Emblema, you always play 3 stand-ups, and you play 1 Terraforming, and I played 1 Wake Up. The same thing with Wake Up applies also for Gargoyle. This card is very, very good if you get to activate it. However, more than half the time when I draw this card, I am not able to activate it, and whenever I'm able to search it, I feel like I'm already playing the game and I could also be winning without it. So I'm actually not sure if this is a card that I would be playing moving forward. I played 1 Phalanx, not 2, and I also played no Bond. The reason for this, I genuinely believe that this deck's biggest issue is the one-ofs. For a deck with a relatively low ceiling compared to other decks in the format that relies very heavily on drawing non-engine, this deck has like an absurd amount of one-ofs that are all not terrible to draw, but you really don't want to, right? Like, those cards include Atri, Gargoyle, Wake Up, Phalanx, and that is a big weakness because the power level of this deck goes down so drastically if you draw 2 or 3 of those cards. 1 is typically fine because you can discard 1 off the field spell if you have access to it, but drawing multiples of these or multiple normal summons or that kind of stuff really messes this deck up. This deck really thrives when it draws 2 engine, 3 non-engine hands. These cards really ruin the math on that. I did decide to play the Bystial package. It was a consideration for me to take this out, even though, you know, I love the Bystial package. I think the grind game that this deck gets from these cards is honestly insane. I want to say I won more games by just playing Bystial hand trap control than actually resolving my Centurion combo, and that is something that I'm going to take into consideration when I make some suggestions for how to maybe adjust the deck moving forward. The amount of times I full comboed with this deck, maybe once or twice. 3 reasons why I didn't get to full combo with Centurion. A, I got stopped and I didn't have the possibility to push through my opponent's hand traps, or I didn't want to against Tenpai. They Mold Charmeat and Fuva me, and I was like, okay, I don't really want to push into that. I don't want to full combo into both of those, right? I can just play the hand trap game against those kind of setups, or do a weaker version of the combo, right? That gives them less draws off of Fuva. B, I didn't even draw a starter. That happened a decent amount of the time. In my last round, I opened no starter game 1 and game 2, so I got cooked real quick. And then the third reason why I didn't full combo is because sometimes my hands were so awkward that I couldn't really full combo because I drew Atri, Phalanx, Gargoyle, that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's my engine, and I played 1 Prosperity because I wanted the deck to be consistent. I wanted to add another engine piece that doesn't clog as much, right? I was considering cards like Bonfire as well, which is an extra copy of Trudea, but I didn't want to draw too many normal summons too many times, so I decided to play Prosperity because this card can be whatever I want it to be, right? So this is 25 cards. I played 40 cards. It left room for 15 hand traps. The hand traps, I decided to go with 3 copies of each of these. I played Ash, Ogre, Mourner, Veiler, and Imperm. My philosophy with this deck was essentially I just wanted to stop my opponent as early as possible, and I did not want them to get to any sort of like half board, right? Sadly, this deck can't play any of the Dominus cards because you have lights and darks in there. I would have loved for that to be possible. There's a few things I want to mention in regards to the hand traps, because what you're going to notice later, I did not play Fuvalos, even in the side deck, and that's not because I didn't have access to it. That's because I think in this deck it's not correct. And that is also the same reasoning why I didn't play Drollin Lockbird or Nibiru the Primal Being, because all of those cards allow your opponent to kind of cook for a while. If you drop a Fuvalos on your opponent, you want to let them play, and I don't want to allow my opponents those things, right? I don't want to allow my opponent to get that far, because if my opponent gets that far, even if I get 2 draws off of Fuvalos, Centurion is not very good at breaking through half of the board, so I can't allow my opponent to set up half a board. I mean, Nibiru in theory is fine. The reason I didn't play Nibiru is because of the popularity of Tenpai. I played against 3 Tenpais, and I think Nibiru is terrible against it. I wanted to just max out on all of these because they're all very, very solid in the main deck. I'm citing more hand traps for going second in the side deck. For the main, I felt like 15 and 40 was fine. I mean, technically it's 18 because I have 3 Bystials as well, which actually do function as hand traps a lot of the times. Okay, extra deck is relatively standard, I think. There's 2 Primera Primus, 2 Blazers, obviously, 2 Legatias, and 1 Auxilla. The reason why it should always be 2 Legatia, 1 Auxilla is because technically, in my opinion, drawing a card is better than searching a Centurion card in this deck, because by default, when you're summoning a level 12 Synchro, you already have access to your engine, and once you are in your Centurion engine, you will stay in your Centurion engine. So there is really no need for a second Auxilla ever. You make the first Auxilla turn 1, search your missing piece, and once that's done, you just want to draw deeper into your deck. And then obviously there's a Crimson Dragon to go into the Blazar. No other targets for the Crimson Dragon. I want to play the Blazar control game. Chaos Angel is MVP. This pattern is really cool. No other synchros in here. I played SP and IP. I never made IP. SP is super important though. For me personally, it's mandatory to play both Almirage and Artemis. The reason for this is quite simple. It's for the play that I mentioned earlier, where you open one of your normal summons and a Bystial Lubellion. The way I like to play those hands, if my normal summon gets stopped, whichever normal summon I make, I like to link it off into either of these 2. Then I want a Lubellion for Magnamute. I want to be able to banish whichever one of these 2 from the graveyard, to summon the Magnamute, to bring back out the Lubellion, to get my Regained, and then I want to make SP draw a card off of Regained. But because you don't know which of the 2 you start with, you need a link 1 for both cases. And the last one is 1 Typhon. I didn't really miss anything. I guess while we're at the extra deck, we can talk about some options that I thought about. There were only 3 cards that I was seriously considering to be in place of maybe the IP Masquerena. One of them is Seals, because with some Bystials and Atri being a dragon and Auxilla being a dragon, it can theoretically come up. Another one that I think is hilarious, I haven't seen anyone play it. I thought about it the day before. I decided against it because I thought it was a little niche, but I actually could have done it once during the tournament and it would have been crazy. Sangenpai Transcendent Dragon. The reason why you can do this is because this thing needs a dragon tuner and a non-tuner dragon. Atri is a dragon tuner, so you can summon this against Tenpai in the battle phase sometimes and they just can't do anything. It's very, very funny. You could even summon it in main phase 1 and then they might not be able to go into their battle phase because they would be cooked. It's a very niche option, but Tenpai is a very popular deck and you could theoretically set it up relatively easily. As long as you can get to your Atri setup plus Bystials, then you can do it. Yeah, so that's the extra deck. I don't think there's too much to be done here, honestly. I noticed I never needed IP Masquerena, and I also never made the second Primera Primus. And now the side deck, I think, is where the most interesting stuff happened, because like I said, I decided against siding Molcharmy Fuvolos for the reasons we've already talked about. My approach instead was I sided 3 Perulias. Now, the reason why, in my opinion, Perulia is different than Fuvolos in this deck is because with Perulia, it doesn't require your opponent to go into the extra deck, right? Like, the whole plan of my deck is to stop my opponent from playing very early on. This lets me interact with my opponent very early still, and the more they want to push, the more I draw and the more hand traps I can find to stop them early. For example, if you activate Perulia and your opponent normal summons Snake Eye Ash, you can actually imperm the Snake Eye Ash without feeling bad about it, right? You see how if you draw Imperm Fuvolos, that's a weird situation. Whereas if you draw Perulia Imperm, there's no problem at all. And if they want to keep pushing with a Diabellstar or something like that, I will still draw more cards off of my Perulia. With the Fuvolos, I'm kind of required to let my opponent cook a little bit, which I don't want. That's why I thought Perulia was a great card for this concept, and I thought Fuvolos, genuinely, I don't think it belongs into a deck like this one, where you want to stop your opponent. And don't get me wrong, Fuvolos is a crazy card. I just think you have to think about where you play it. I think Fuvolos is at its best when you're playing a deck that has a very strong engine that can push through some stuff. If you use Fuvolos and nothing else, and your opponent decides to pass on like a half board with like IP into SP possibilities, maybe some Fire King cards, Centurion can't push through that, but something like Yubel or Fire King or Snake Eye, those can push through those things. So in those decks, I would still play Fuvolos. But in a deck that realistically has maybe 1 or 2 pushes, you can't allow your opponent to get this far even. That's why I played these cards instead. And I'm happy to report that I drew Driver 0 times. Whenever I drew these, they put in hella work. I actually never drew Gamma, I only drew Delta, but Delta is the one that negates spell cards. The plan for this, basically, depending on the matchup, you can do different things with it. You can obviously stop powerful cards like Nightmare Throne or Nightmare Pain against Yubel. My plan against the Azamina engine was to hit the Hollow Azamina. You don't want to hit the continuous spell, the Deception, because this does not work on a card effect. This only works on a card activation. So you would have to use it before they even have to tribute for cost. So what you would rather do is let them activate the Deception, let them pay for cost, let them search the fusion spell, and then you just delta the fusion spell, and then it's in the graveyard and nothing happened, right? So the idea basically, and why I think this deck is good against fire specifically, which I didn't play against a single fire, but most of the starters in the fire decks these days, or not most of them, but a lot of them, they have to pay 2 cards to get a play, right? If they go Diabellstar, they're investing 2 cards out of their hand to get a play. If they're using Deception, they're investing 2 cards out of their hand to get a play. If they're using 1-for-1, they're investing 2 cards to get a play. The only cards that give them a play with 1 card only, Bonfire and Snake Eye Ash, and technically Pop. And so that's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to have a lot of these 1-to-1 hand traps, because then I would be trading very favorably with Snake Eyes, because all of their plays require multiple investments to play, right? Essentially, after siding, I will have all of these hand traps in my deck. Perulia will refill my hand. The more they push, the more cards I'll draw, the higher my chances will be to see those cards, and I just want to stop them from playing complete. That is the idea, and I didn't think that Fuvolos had a place in this sort of scenario. I noticed that this approach is not very good depending on which deck you play against, right? This was a meta call for decks like Snake Eye and Yubel. For example, one of the rounds that I lost, I played against a deck that is actually quite good into this sort of thing, was Toy Box White Forest, because I played against that deck. They opened Toy Box, a normal summon, plus LZ in game 3, and it's like, well, at that point, my hand traps, they trade very poorly into those kind of cards. I drew 3 hand traps. They still ended on some sort of board that I couldn't play through. I don't think a fire deck would have done that. That was the hand trap approach for this deck. I played 3 Cosmics because that card is phenomenal right now. Going first, it's good against almost any deck, because even the combo decks like Yubel and Fire King, they play with their continuous cards. Really good in the Centurion mirror match, even useful against Tenpai, can counter random floodgates that people side all the time. Speaking of, I still played the deck lockdowns, and there can be only one. These cards are good. Whenever you draw these cards, you typically win the game, even if you get stopped. So there's no reason not to play these. So that's the side deck. deck. The approach for this deck is fine. I mean, look, I think in this format, if you're a hand trap deck, you gotta embrace the fact that you're a hand trap deck. You gotta focus on playing the most efficient hand traps, as many as possible, not really letting your opponent even get into their combos, because that's the problem with decks like Yubel and Snake Eye, is once you let them cook for a little, most of their cards generate so much advantage that you won't be able to keep up. As far as my learnings go from this deck, just so that none of you make the same mistake, I've played this deck mostly in Master Duel, right? Where the deck is slightly different, of course. My first loss of the day was in round number 2 to Tenpai. Game 1, I went first. They draw face, Hurulia, and Fuva lost me, and I got the full setup without giving them a single card, and I had like a hand trap in hand or something and a Bystial. The reason I lost is because on their turn, it's an interaction that you need to encounter to really understand or to be aware of it. What I usually do on my opponent's turn in Master Duel is when I summon out my Centurions, I do Chainlink 1 Primera, Chainlink 2 stand-up to play around something like, I don't know, Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre on the Primera. Something happened that I didn't really encounter ever in Master Duel. What they did was they impulsed my field spell, and then I lost because I couldn't make Chaos Angel, because my plan was to summon Druis Worm, make Chaos Angel, banish their field spell, and then Druis Worm can send the Chandra to the graveyard, and the game would have been over on the spot because I knew all the cards they had except for that one unknown. So I went Chainlink 1, Chainlink 2 stand up, and then they impulsed my stand up, and I was like, you know what? I'm glad that happened today at a regional, because I learned that now. Sometimes you just gotta go to a tournament and you learn by losing. It is what it is. It's fine. That was my experience with the deck. If I was gonna continue playing Centurion, which I'm still considering it, even though my performance with it wasn't the greatest, but I do think I would want to make some changes. And for that, let's talk about some of the cards that I thought about and elected not to play. We've already talked about my reasoning to not play Nibiru, Droll, and Molcharmi Fuvalos. I didn't play Retaliating Sea, but that was mainly for side deck patterns and space reasons, because I'm already siding in these cards for going second, and if you look at my main deck, there's not that much I can side out for going second. I cannot side all of those in for going second, and I think those cards were better than this card overall, but it's a good card in my opinion in this format. I was thinking about, and now hear me out, I was thinking about making this deck bigger, because like I said earlier, my biggest issue with this deck is drawing these cards. These cards, what annoys me about this deck, because I'm playing a very fair deck, and I want to draw as much non-engine as possible, but I still want to make sure I can see a starter or maybe even an extender, and it really messes up my hands if I draw too many of these cards. That is why I cut them down a little bit, but I still drew them a decent amount. And I was thinking about doing something that people did in Dragon Link back in the day, because it had a very similar problem with cards like Boot Sector Launch, Dragon Ravine, and all that kind of stuff, right? They had the problem where you don't want to draw those cards. Your deck is significantly better if you don't draw those cards. And so I thought like, okay, well, you have a 40 card deck, you have your engine here, you have your non-engine here, and then you have some of your engine requirements up here, right? So what you can do theoretically is, if you can add more cards to your engine and more cards to your non-engine in the same amounts, you would end up with a deck that is slightly better because you draw these cards less often. More hand traps is theoretically possible, right? You can look into main decking cards like Drollin Lockbird or Nibiru just to have more hand traps. That is available to you, right? So I thought about doing that. And then for the engine side, there's obviously the possibility to play more engine as well, because Bonfire gives you more copies of your normal summons, for example. So I was sitting here on Saturday night and I was messing around with some of the numbers. I was genuinely considering turning up to the tournament with like a 46 card version of the deck or something. The reason why I did not do that was because I felt like there was some individual cards in the deck that I really wanted to draw. Bonfire is not the same quality as some of the other cards in the deck, and that is mainly these 10. The Field Spell, Emblema, and Lubellion, I think are very, very important cards because they are not normal summon reliant. They give you pushes without normal summoning, and I thought that was very valuable. I did not want to reduce my chances of seeing these cards, but I just wanted to bring up the idea. Maybe it is something worth trying. If you encounter a lot of games that you lose because you draw Wake Up or you draw Atri or you draw Gargoyle, I think it's worth mentioning that I think you can push this deck up a little bit in terms of the deck count, and you won't lose that much consistency because you can add some more starters and some more hand traps. Even for other decks, the possibility of going over 40 is something that sometimes should be considered more often. I also don't do it very much. Most of the time I play decks that are 40 or close to it, but it was a genuine consideration for this deck. These cards are obviously an option. I just want to say my experience with this deck, I did not miss the second Phalanx the entire day. I missed Bonds once. I acknowledge the fact that both of these cards are good, but I simply did not want to increase the count of these cards. I considered a Kashtira package over the Bystial package. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because there was a Centurion list that won a regional without the Bystial cards. It played some Fenrirs and some Wraith Soth and a set rotation instead. And I was talking to Nesh on Saturday, and Nesh said, hey, if you're playing Centurion and you're just hand trapping back and forth with your opponent, why don't you play Fenrir? Because Fenrir is like really good when you're playing a hand trap back and forth. And at first, I thought that made sense. I took the Bystials out for a while on Saturday and messed around with it. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and then I realized I don't actually think it's true that Fenrir is better than Lubellion in hand trap games. Because in my opinion, Lubellion is insane in those kind of games. Like, imagine this very simple example, which actually comes up a lot when you're playing this deck. Let's just compare. You draw a normal summon plus Lubellion or a normal summon plus Fenrir, right? Look at the difference in the plays that you would make. In the case of these two, you would special Fenrir, you would normal summon, you would get hand trap, and you would essentially pass the turn over. You've gone +2 because you get a Fenrir search and they lose the hand trap, so they will have 5 cards in hand and you have a Fenrir and a Fenrir follow-up. It's not bad. But if you compare that to the other option, right? In this case, you start with Primera. Let's say you get Ashed. You use Lubellion, you grab Magna, you link off the Primera into the Artemis, you summon Magnamoot by banishing the Primera, you activate Magna, you bring back Lubellion by tributing the Magna, you place Regain, and then you make SP Little Knight, and then you use SP Little Knight on the Artemis, trigger the Regain, put the Artemis back into your deck, and draw a card. And then in the end phase, you get a Magnamoot search for Druisworm or Baldrake, probably Druisworm. In my opinion, if you directly compare these two situations, I think the SP regained Druisworm random draw gives me so much of a higher chance of winning that hand trap grind game. And that's why I decided to play the Bystials instead. And I'm gonna be honest with you, if anything, the Bystials did more work than the Centurion cards. I'm not gonna lie. Like, the Bystials were crazy good for me. I think the Bystial hand trap control approach was definitely correct. But I wanted to bring it up because I like talking about some of these options that I went through in deck building, just to showcase that I do think about these things and I want to give you guys my opinion on them. I don't think these cards are bad at all. We might as well take advantage of the fact that this is live right now. It's a live deck profile. So what about you ask me some stuff that you want to know about this deck? Side patterns? Okay, side patterns are relatively simple. When you go first, the only thing I've ever sided throughout the entire day is obviously these 7 cards. You never touch these cards when you go first. Going first, I have never taken out even a slight bit of engine. I only took out hand traps, and obviously that will depend on the matchup. In some matchups, if one of those cards is not very good, like Mourner, I will take out all of the copies. Against Tenpai, there is 2 things that I did throughout the day that I think are worth considering, depending on what you see from their deck in game 1. And that is not easy to super simplify this and tell you always do this, always do that. If you see them on Lightning Storm, I like siding out Infinite Impermanence because that will just die to Lightning Storm. If you don't see them on any kind of breakers though, what I like to do is side out some of the hand traps that'll die to Shifter, because both of these cards have to go to the graveyard. Siding going first with this deck is relatively easy though. You just switch around your non-engine. For going second is definitely more interesting, because going second you have to usually side upwards of 8 cards. Just a small hint, do not side Cosmic Cyclone versus Fire King when you're going second. With the same logic as earlier, you don't want them to have a Fire King Island on their board. If they have a Fire King Island on their board and a setup with it, you probably lose the game anyways, even if you have Cosmic, because your deck will not push through their combo. Even if you Cosmic the field spell, they will still have the stuff that revives from the graveyard, Garunix, Promethean Princess. If you let them get that far, Centurion will not break their board. So Cosmic going second against Fire King in this deck does not make sense. It can make sense in other decks, in this one it doesn't. Usually going second, I would side in these 8 cards in almost any matchup, honestly. I would always take out Pot of Prosperity. I would take out some amount of Bystials, and that very much depends on the matchup. And I would also very often actually side out a bunch of these 1-ups, because my theory theory is that going second, if I hand trap my opponent, it doesn't matter if I get to full combo. If I already hand trap them and I can play and I can make my synchros and all that kind of stuff, I don't need Atri to win the game. And I also don't need the fancy wake up combo to win the game. And I probably also don't need Phalanx to revive Primera Primus or something to win the game. So those were all cards that I sided out a lot of times. Literally, the stuff we're doing in Master Duel is what I was doing going second. Like, there's no Atri in Master Duel and we don't play wake up in Master Duel. So like, that's what I was doing after siding when I went second. I did not want these cards in my hand ever. And then with the Bystial package, it just depends on whether Bystials are good in the matchup or not. There were matchups where going second, all 7 of these go out. If you think Bystials are really good in a matchup, you could keep all of them, but I would still suggest you take out at least 2 Lubellion because Lubellion is not a hand trap going second. I like keeping 1 with Regained so that you can access it via Magnamute, for example. You can still get the Lubellion and the Regain and get your grind game going that way. This is pretty much the maximum that I would keep in when I go second. And sometimes if I wanted to keep a higher Bystial count, I side it out like a normal summon, a Trudea or Primera. Typically, I like to side out Trudea more than Primera because Primera is a tuner, so it extends better with Bystials and stuff like that. And then obviously, it goes without saying, but if any of the hand traps suck in a certain matchup, then you would also take that one out. How often did you go into time playing no time cards? Seems rough. I went into time 0 times with this deck. This deck plays very fast games most of the time because you simplify the game very, very early. You can tell right from the get-go usually whether a game is winnable or not. If your opponent pushes through your hand traps, you can look at your hand and be like, you know what? I'm not breaking your board. We can just go next. And if you stop your opponent, then their turns are usually rather quick as well. Have you considered playing Shifter? I considered it for a moment. I will say that I think if you wanted to play Shifter in this deck, you would probably have to adjust it a little bit. The annoying thing about Shifter, this deck can play under Shifter, but in some other ways, it is also more annoying than you would think. For example, Ghost Ogre is dead, Veiler is dead under Shifter. Stand Up does not work under Shifter because it has to go to the graveyard. Lubellion has to go to the graveyard. And by extension, Primera also is not a starter anymore because if you open Primera, the standard combo line for the 1-card combo is to grab Stand Up, and Stand Up doesn't work under Shifter. So you lose a lot of potential starters under Shifter. So you could play Shifter in this deck, but I think you'd have to change it up a little bit. Maybe you would play some Bonfires and 1 less Primera so that you can start with Trudea more often, that kind of stuff. And you talk about end boards. Okay, so if you don't get interrupted, which only happened once or twice, let's just assume no Bystials because they will obviously change how you do it. Let me walk you through this real quick. You open Trudea. You would go Trudea, place Primera, special Primera. Here you have 2 options. You can either go for Wake Up or you can go for the Field Spell. They both work. Let's say Wake Up, get a level 4 token. You would make Primera Primus. Primera Primus can get you Emblema Oath. Emblema Oath will place Atri. Atri will summon out, draw you a card. So you would be back on 5 cards in hand. And then you would go Auxilla, and then Auxilla gets you the Field Spell. Field Spell plays Gargoyle, Wake Up, and Phalanx. And then you summon out the Gargoyle as a level 4. Field Spell earlier, better into Improm level 12. Yeah, just for the end board, the order doesn't matter. But in order to sequence better into hand traps, it's better to go Field Spell first. If you do this, what you would do is you would go into the end phase now. Then your opponent would be forced to Nibiru immediately, which if they do, you can still use Phalanx to bring back your Auxilla, and then you still have the setup for Crimson Dragon next turn. And the reason why you can go into the end phase is because what you will do in the end phase, Phalanx, bring back the Primus, and then you can simply trigger the Field Spell to make the Crimson Dragon in the end phase, and then still tag out Crimson Dragon into the Blaze. This will place an Autry. So what this end board does, you would still have 5 cards in hand, which if you're a god gamer, that's your hand right now. 1-card combo gives you a draw, an Omni, these set up in the spell trap zone, which on your opponent's turn, you discard it for the Field Spell, right? So, okay, fair enough. On your opponent's turn, you draw Autry, then you draw the second Veiler, of course. Trudea, if you don't have any Bystials, you would make another Crimson into another Blazar, so you have 2 Omnis and whichever non-engine you've drawn. Playing Wake Up, Gargoyle, and all that kind of stuff. I think in theory, when you look at all the lines that it can do if it goes uninterrupted, I think it's ideal. I did notice that, as it always is with Yu-Gi-Oh though, the practice was a little bit different than the theory because a lot of the times I didn't actually full combo. Like the Gargoyle, yes, in some of the combo lines, you can do some cool stuff because you summon it from the spell trap zone. It goes back into your hand. You can summon it out later and all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, all that is cool. Never did that a single time. I searched Wake Up Centurion once the entire day because it's not a very good card otherwise. One Phalanx, I think, is completely enough. And majority of the times, I was even thinking about searching it instead of sending it with Wake Up because it was safer, so that if I get hand trapped later on, I still have at least a Phalanx already set up to interrupt my opponent. I don't know. I feel like with this deck, maybe a version of it that plays less bricks and is better in a grind game would be better, but I'm not exactly sure how that would look. One thing, I don't even have him here right now, but one card that I keep thinking about whenever I'm playing this deck, I keep missing Emmet. The reason why I like Emmet is because whenever I draw Emmet, it's actually a good discard for my field spell. Because if I discard Emmet for my field spell and then my Primera gets impermed or ashed or whatever, I still have a great play on my opponent's turn. Whereas Gargoyle does not offer any of that. Like, yes, if I'm resolving my combos, Gargoyle is better, but if I'm not resolving my combos, Emmet is better. So I think Emmet is one of those cards that seems weaker in theory, but might be better in practice than Gargoyle. And it's a card that I haven't played in a long time. What I'm trying to say is I think when you're looking at cards like Wake Up and Gargoyle and Atri and all that kind of stuff, they are very good cards, but you got to ask yourself the question, do I want my deck to be better if it's not interrupted at all? Or do I want my deck to be better when everyone is throwing hand traps around? Which I think in the format we're in right now, I think hand traps are being thrown around very aggressively. So I'm leaning towards, I would probably try to tone down this deck a little bit and make it more resilient to hand traps rather than try to play the fancy version and try to make full combos happen. What do you think about Sengenjin? I thought about Sengenjin too. I think one of the biggest issues with Centurion and playing extenders is the fact that quite simply, you have no idea what extender you need. And this is a problem. The type of extender that you need is different depending on which one you start with. If you start with Trudea and you get impermed, you need a tuner extender. If you start with Primera and you get stopped, you need a non-tuner extender. And that is the most frustrating thing about this deck. Lubellion, I think, is good in both cases. And that's why I'm playing Lubellion, because of the line that I showed you earlier. Even if you don't have it matching, the SP regain play, I think, is good enough. This was relatively long. In case you're watching this on YouTube, I hope we were able to cut it down a little bit so it was better digestible. I thought it was cool to do this live and have some questions and interactivity and all that kind of stuff to explain my choices better. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think of the concept. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you watched it on YouTube. Let me know what you thought of it. If you're trying Centurion, I hope this gave you some stuff to think about and some food for thought. That was ultimately the goal with this, because obviously I didn't do super well at the regional, but even then, that's the point of going to these kind of tournaments, is to learn and take away something from it. And even if it's just as simple as in the TCG, make sure that your stand-up does not get Dominus Impulse. If that's the only thing you learned, you still learned something, you know? So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.